So as I told you in the last lecture, we have a problem in this implementation. Can you spot the problem? It's right here on line 67 and 68. The problem is the violation of separation of concerns. So earlier, we created a service to encapsulate all the details about consuming the HTTP services on our backend. We introduced this service to hide all this complexity from our component. But look at these lines. Here, we're working with a response object that comes from the server. We're also checking the status of this response and comparing it with the 404 error. This is not the language of our component. This is the language of our service. So we should change this implementation and move this logic inside our service. And here in the component, instead of working with the response object, we need to work with an object that is part of our application domain, something that is not specific to the HTTP protocol. So let's see how we can change this implementation. So let's go back to our post service. Here in delete post method, if there is an exception, if there is an error, I want to catch that error. And instead of sending the response object to our component, I want to send a different kind of object, an object that is part of our application domain. So first, let's see how we can catch this error. As you learned earlier, this delete method returns an observable. Observable is a type that is part of a third-party library called reactive extensions. And this type has a bunch of useful methods that we call operators. But these operators are not there by default. So if I add dot here, the only methods we have here on the observable are for each, lift, and subscribe, which you have seen before. One method or one operator that we need is catch. And we need to specifically import this on the top. So on the top, I want to import the catch operator on observables. The syntax is a little bit different from the other import statements. So we add import. Now in quotes, we add rxjs, which is the name of the library, /add /operator /catch. Now we have a bunch of other operators and they are all defined in a namespace like this. So with this, now when we go back to our delete post method, and add dot here, look, we have the catch method. But the icon is different. It's the icon of a field, not a method. But this is actually a method. So I'm not sure why we're getting the wrong icon. But that aside, we want to call this to catch the error. And then we need to send a different kind of error object to the consumer of this service, which is our post component. So here, let's add an arrow function. Error, which is of type response, goes to like this. Now here we have a compilation error because this is not a void method. Here we need to return an observable that has an error. So the consumer of this service, in this case our component, will get that error and do something with it. Now how can we return an observable that has an error? Well, first we need to import the observable type on the top. So import observable from rxjs /observable. Now back in our method, here we have a method observable dot throw, and this method returns a new observable that has an error. Now what is the type of that error? The type of that error should be something specific to our application, not the response object. So we need to create a new class to represent application-specific errors. So here in the app folder, under common, I'm going to add a new file. Call it app-error.ts. And here we simply export a class called app-error. With this, we can represent an application error. Now back in our service, now here as an argument to the throw method, we want to pass an app error object. So new app error. Now it's a good practice to include the original error inside this app error because somewhere we're going to get that error and log it on the server. So I'm going to go back to app error. Here I'm going to add a constructor. This constructor takes a parameter called original error, which is optional and its type is any. Now we can decorate this with the public keyword, and this will be a field in our class that we can access when logging this error. Okay. Now back in post service, we can pass this original error object here. And finally, we need to return this result. And you can see the compilation error is gone. So to quickly recap, what we're doing here is we're catching the error object, which is an instance of the response class, and then we're returning a different kind of error that is specific to our application. Okay? Now we need to change this implementation and check for the status of the error. So if it's 404 or not found, we want to return a different kind of error. Because in our component, we need to know if that post exists or not. And we don't want to check the status of the response object. Okay? So back in the comment folder, I'm going to add a new file, not-found-error.ts. Once again, I'm going to export a class, not-found-error. I want this class to derive from the app error because this is a kind of application error, but it's more specific. Okay? So we add extends app error. That's all we have to do. Now back in our service, we can check the status of the error. If error.status is 404, we want to return an observable that has an error, and the type of this error is not found error. Now in this case, I don't want to put the original error here because we're not going to log this on the server. This is a legitimate error, not an unexpected error, okay? We're almost done. The last step. Let's go back to our component. So here, now instead of working with the response object, we're going to work with app error or one of its derivatives. Because in our post service, we are throwing either an app error or not found error. And since not found error is a kind of app error, we can say that essentially here, we're catching a response object and throwing an app error object. So back in our component, the type of this error should be app error. And then instead of this ugly code to check the status and see if it's 404, we can check to see if this error is an instance of not found error. In JavaScript, we have an operator called instance of. So if this error is instance of not found error, then we display this friendly message to the user. Now here is an exercise for you. I want you to modify the code in the createPost method. So here, instead of working with the response object and checking the status to see if it's 400, we want to work with application-specific errors. So go ahead and modify this code, and you can see my solution in the next lecture.